Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who are on the East Coast, welcome to What's Your Data Path, a series of webinars with data scientists and people in a variety of professions who work with data to learn more about, um, join us to learn more about careers in data science and how data infuses almost every workplace today. My name is Jo Louie, and I am at the nonprofit organization Education Development Center, or EDC, based outside of Boston, Massachusetts. I am the director of Data Paths, which is a multi-year project funded by the state of Massachusetts to promote interests and skills in data science among students in grades K through 16 throughout the state. And you can learn more about the Data Paths project through our website, which is accessible through the QR code on this slide. Next slide, please. So the Data Paths project is providing an array of professional learning opportunities and curriculum materials to help teachers integrate more data science practices into their current teaching. We've also developed an online career hub, which includes a suite of resources to help students learn about data science careers. This webinar is one in a series that we are holding this spring and next fall to talk with professionals working in a wide range of fields and who use data intensively or in unique ways in their work. For those of you attending live, our goal is to inform and potentially inspire you to share information with young people about potential careers that use data. We are also recording this session and aim to place on our project website the whole hour-long webinar, as well as clips that people can share with students in classrooms or in out-of-school settings. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda for the next hour. We have two very exciting guest speakers who will present about themselves and their work in total for about 20 minutes. One speaker, Heather Goldstone, is a senior fellow at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and that's based in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She was formerly a science correspondent at WGBH in Boston. Our other speaker, Christina Shintani, is a cartographer at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. She has worked previously at National Geographic and other places. After they speak, I'll jump back in to have a brief discussion with the presenters, and then we'll open up the webinar to take your questions. Just some logistics. All participants are muted during this webinar, but you can use the chat feature to talk with other attendees. And if you have questions for the panelists, please submit those through the Q&A box, which is located on your Zoom control bar. I also want to acknowledge Jen Stiles. She is a member of the Data Paths team, and she is managing many of the slides and the technical aspects of this webinar behind the scenes. Next slide. So that's it for me. Now let's turn to our speakers. Why don't we start with Heather? Please take it away.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm going to quickly hit screen share here and hope that, okay. So I'm really excited to be here, and I titled my presentation Melding Data and Narrative because I believe that phrase may be responsible for me being here. I think that might be what caught Jo's eye in a bio of me that she found on the website. And so I'm going to give you a little insight into what I mean by that phrase. I will tell you two of the key takeaways of my story right up front. One is that if you or your students or those you're working with think that going into a career in journalism or storytelling is a way to avoid numbers and data, please disabuse them of that notion right away. The second is be careful what you write in your bios online. Might get you in trouble. So I'm going to actually go all the way with my data path back to being about 12 years of age. I went to a summer camp that was run by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. It was a fabulous 3-week program We traveled on a converted fishing boat from the top of the Chesapeake Bay all the way to the bottom, camped along the way, did all sorts of water quality and other kind of ecological and environmental experiments and experiences. And by the end of it, I was horrified by what I was learning about the state of the Chesapeake Bay. And I announced that I wanted to become a female Jacques Cousteau, sail the oceans and save the oceans through science. I kind of put on my blinders and went straight ahead with that vision for about 10 years. And the picture to the left on this slide, where I'm holding a kind of hybrid animal that was my mom's best attempt at a zebra fish, is me at my thesis defense, finishing my PhD in marine biology. I had studied zebrafish, which look nothing like that. They're little tiny black and white striped fish this big, but um, and during that experience in graduate school, I had realized really quite early on that, in fact, being in the lab did not feel at all like the right fit for me. And by the end of that, I was contemplating what else I could do that would be in the science sphere, in the ocean sphere. I still really had that same motivation of wanting to try to save the oceans and feeling like science was a really important part of that. And where I landed was that all of the things that I liked about science were actually the storytelling parts of science. It was writing papers, it was writing grants, it was going to meetings. And so I walked into our local public radio station right here in Woods Hole and introduced myself, said, I have a newly minted PhD. I hosted a radio show in high school. Would you like a science reporter? And whether it's to their credit or not, they said, sure. And for about 4 years, I was still doing research, and on the side, I was just kind of doing radio stories as I could squeeze it in. And it was about 4 years later that I finally made that leap over to radio reporting. And what I encountered was a really interesting, different perspective on what science and what journalism are. Well, I guess a range of different perspectives. As I was leaving science, I was in some cases encountering scientists who thought that going to journalism was kind of going to the dark side, to all of those people over there who distort science and ignore science and just try to tell good, fantastic, and really catchy stories. And then on the journalism side, folks who thought, well, science, we need to really tell human stories. Science isn't necessarily compatible with that or part of that. And scientists make it completely impossible to understand what's going on with science anyway. And so I really wanted to find a way to bring those two together, because what I saw in science and journalism were two different groups of people, both trying to make sense of the world in slightly different ways. And so I had a fabulous run of about 12 years, as Joe mentioned, at CAI down here on the Cape and GBH up in Boston, doing field reporting, hosting my own show, doing a whole lot of different things with radio and even a little bit of TV there for a while. And it was about 6 years ago, maybe seven, I guess, when this kind of next transition started. I was spending a lot of my time actually talking to scientists from Woodwell Climate Research Center, because they were some of the only scientists who would actually answer my questions and talk to me about current events, especially as related to climate. A lot of scientists just felt that was too much of a hot potato, potentially too political to comment on current events from a climate perspective. But Woodwell scientists were willing to work with me to kind of walk that tightrope. And so when an opportunity to work more closely at Woodwell with those scientists to help craft messaging and really get Woodwell science out there, I leapt at that. And so for about 6 years, I led Woodwell's marketing and communications activities until very recently. I made another transition, and that's the last picture on this page. And I guess I would say at this point, my data path seems to be kind of a spiral that gets wider and wider as it goes. I've recently launched at Woodwell a new podcast that is really about telling human stories about climate change, but it's very much grounded in data, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. My colleague Christina is going to talk about one way of melding data and narrative, which is to really take data and essentially directly translate it into another medium, visual or oral or some other way of really just representing that data in a way that is not numbers on a page or on a screen and telling a story that way. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. What I spent a lot of time as a journalist trying to do with data and narrative is understand how we can really interweave these two. Because data, in my mind, is are a source of ground truthing for our own beliefs and perceptions, and a source of perspective on our own individual experiences. But we know that the human brain is not always very good at really integrating, and certainly the emotional part of us as humans is not necessarily very good at interpreting and integrating large scale data. So, for example, if we tell people that 1 million people are experiencing something, that sounds really big, but it doesn't tend to evoke a strong emotional response. Whereas if you say that person that you're looking at is experiencing something, it's much more likely to actually resonate with people. And so narrative is how we get to that more emotional side of the human brain. The brain is literally wired. We have evolved to take in narrative. It's the way that we have shared wisdom and beliefs throughout human evolution. It helps us establish relevance. It gives us connection at a human level between ourselves and someone else experiencing something. It evokes emotion. And there's actually science that now shows it can help with the retention of information because of all of those other aspects of it. And so again, I was trying to figure out how do we meld these two? We don't just say to people, a lot of people are experiencing this. We also don't want to just say, hey, this person over here is experiencing that, because then we lack that larger perspective. And so it was a constant challenge to try to interweave those two. And unfortunately, we're so used to everything that we have ever written, said, done being preserved in posterity on the internet. But unfortunately, my very, very favorite example of this from a colleague of mine was just pre the days when all radio stories were put online, and neither of us can actually find a copy of it. But it was a beautiful story that he told, that the big picture data story was the immense number of people in this country who are caring for someone with Alzheimer's or a form of dementia, and themselves suffering trauma and mental health issues and health issues as a result of their caregiving. And the way that he illustrated that story, the narrative, was one individual woman and her experience. But what he would do is he would give you her experience. You would hear her voice, and then he would come in and say, she's one of X number in the United States having this same experience. And then we would get a little bit more of her story. And he would say, we understand that this is why this happens in the brain. And then we would get a little bit more of her story, and he would come back in with another piece of data. And it was just a beautiful 6 minutes of going back and forth between these two, so that by the end, you had both of those fully fleshed out. I can't claim that I ever told a story that was that perfectly a melding of those two. But that, I think, is a really powerful way to use those two forms of conveying information together. Another way that I think we can use data is actually, it's kind of a pyramid or as a foundation to find the stories that we want to tell. And I actually had a journalist reach out to me from the Washington Post a few years ago to say, okay, I'm planning out my year and I'm looking for stories, and I'm going through large data sets to find trends, to find outliers, to find hotspots of a certain sort that are places where I can then go and deeply on the ground report a story. You at Woodwell have a lot of those large data sets, and as Christina will show you, you translate those into maps that make it really easy to see both the trends and the hotspots and the outliers. Can we work together to actually just figure out the stories, the handful of stories that I'm going to tell this year? And so I think that's another really powerful way of melding data and narrative and ensuring that we are telling stories that connect on a human level and are very much rooted in the data, in the science of what we know to be happening in our world. And I'm going to give you one example, because that's actually the way that I went about developing the podcast that we've now recently launched and that I'm now hosting. And this is rooted in data that comes from close to 15 years of research conducted by folks at George Mason University and Yale University, constantly looking at public understanding of climate science, public opinion about climate change, and also a whole growing body of research about kind of climate psychology and the link between emotions and information intake and retention. The short version of that is that close to 3/4 of Americans know that climate change is happening. They know that it's human caused. And in fact, close to 2/3 of Americans are worried about climate change. But closer to 1/3 see it or hear about it in the media, talk to family or friends about it, or encounter their friends or colleagues talking about it. And as a result, we're not getting data from each other about how we're all feeling. And so, without talking about it or knowing how others feel, the vast majority of us are underestimating how many other people are worried about climate change. Scientists have called this the spiral of silence, right? That as we think that other people don't share the concern that we're having, we stop talking about it, which amplifies the misperception that no one else cares. And as a result, very few of us take action on climate change. And so it was looking at all of this data and really looking at it over the course of years and feeling like there must be stories and ways of talking about climate change that could help us run this spiral in reverse. What might those be? That we started to think about the podcast that we have now launched, which is, again, this idea of kind of being rooted in data and understanding the big picture, but then diving into individual stories. The podcast is called Not a Climate Scientist. And this is another part of things that just trying to broaden the conversation so that while I'm at a science institution and we understand and know that scientists play an incredibly important role in addressing climate change, all of us need to be part of doing it. And so this is an effort for us to say, okay, the data tells us that everyone is being impacted in some way. We're going to go find the individuals who have figured out what that connection is. We're going to share their individual story with other people so that they can then find their ways to connect and take action. So again, an example of kind of using data to inform what stories we tell, the ways that we tell them, but then the stories that we tell are deeply human ones. So I will stop now and hand it back over to Joe and to Christina.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. Christina, do you want to just dive right in?
Yeah. All right. So, as Joe said in the introduction, my name is Christina Shintani, and I'm a cartographer at Woodwell with Heather. And I create maps and data visualizations that help communicate climate science. And of course, a really big part of being a cartographer is how we process, analyze, and visualize that data. The goal is always to transform that data into a format that helps people understand a story or message. So it's actually very similar to what Heather was just saying, is melding together data and a narrative, because data is the thing that we're trying to communicate, but narrative is how you get through to people. And so maps do that in a visual way. The process can look different of map making depending on your audience. And at Woodwell, most of the maps that I make can be binned into 4 different audience categories. And the first one are scientists. I work with a lot of climate scientists, of course, who have geospatial data that they need to communicate the importance of their research. So this is a poster map that I made for a colleague about the carbon flux data they collect across the Arctic and why that's important. The second group of audience is the general public. So I make maps for our website, social media, and the magazine to translate data and climate science data for anyone, regardless of their prior knowledge of climate science. So this is a map I made for social media a few summers back when Canada had a particularly bad wildfire season. So it shows the historically burned areas and how that summer's burned area was significantly higher than any year in recent memory. The third group of people that I make maps for is for local communities that we partner with, who want to advocate for climate resilience for themselves and future generations. So this is a map that I co-produced with a Sami reindeer herder in Norway about how infrastructure development and climate change is affecting reindeer herding and the Sami way of life. And part of my job is not only to make maps, but also to talk to people about maps and how powerful and persuasive of a communication tool it is, and how to use maps to achieve their goals for their community. So these pictures are from a mapping workshop that I helped facilitate this past January in Norway with Sami reindeer herders. The fourth audience is for decision makers and policymakers. So some of my colleagues at Woodwell help politicians understand climate science so that they can make informed decisions for their constituents. And maps are a really big part of communicating that information to them. These photos are of Senators Ed Markey of Massachusetts and Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska looking at the Arctic map that I shared earlier. Um, and they're both really big fans of our maps, which is really nice to hear. And the maps always spark questions from them and really good conversation. So when it comes to the map making process, of course, data is completely central. Every map is essentially a really big sandwich of data. And cartography, unfortunately, is mostly a desk job. We aren't out there like Lewis and Clark surveying the land, which means that we completely rely on data. And one of the ways that I can get data, as an example, is through Google Earth Engine, which is the screenshot on the left, which is a cloud-based platform that helps you process global data with code. And then once I have all the data I need, the two screenshots on the right kind of show you all of the layers of data that go into one map. And these screenshots are not comprehensive. There's more layers. So even though a map flattens everything, even the simplest map is made with a very long list of data layers all smushed together, but in a way that's understandable. So I won't get into detail on these, but these are just a few select software programs that I use to gather data and to make maps with them. So how did I become a cartographer? Because when I was growing up, and even when I was in college, I had no idea that this was a job. It's not exactly at the end of, firefighter, doctor, cartographer, like no one says that. So how does anyone know how to get there? I got my bachelor's in physical geography and my master's in geography. And I was actually studying the science of rivers, fluvial geomorphology, and remote sensing of rivers. And while I was in grad school, I took a cartography class at the infographics lab at UO. And that's what totally changed my trajectory. And I just fell in love with it. But of course, there are extremely few cartography programs in the country. So it's not a career path that a lot of people are familiar with. Um, so after grad school, before I got my first paid job as a cartographer, I spent a lot of nights and weekends making maps in my free time. A lot of cartographers are self-taught because of the lack of cartographic education. Um, and I did that until I got my first job as a cartographer at a public transit consulting firm. Um, and I made public transit maps. I learned a lot about how it's done. I have a much greater appreciation. It's extremely difficult. And I worked there for a few years until I did a really big pivot and got a job at National Geographic as a graphics editor. So I made maps for their magazine and website on a big range of topics, climate change being one of them, but also conservation and biodiversity. I made a lot of maps about animals and I learned about all different kinds of animals, which was very cool. And then after Nat Geo, I came to Woodwell, of course, and you've seen some of those maps. But regardless of where I worked or on what topic, they all require a very diverse set of skills that you wouldn't normally think go together. So on the one hand, I have to write and edit code and analyze data, but on the other, I have to understand design and how to construct the layout of a map and how to use color, which sounds like a very vague skill, but is very central to my job. Um, Anyone can learn code and data analysis, but understanding design and color is a little bit harder to teach and has to have some kind of inherent natural skill to build off of. Um, so this combination is actually what makes cartography a really fascinating and fun job. I get to use both sides of my brain and be able to make maps on so many different topics, as you saw, ranging from public transit to climate change. Um, Everyone needs maps, in my opinion. Um, yeah, so thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you both. Thanks to both of you for those great presentations. So I'd love to be able to start off our conversation with a few questions from me. Maybe circling back to Heather. I I loved hearing about your journey and just your experience as a storyteller of science stories and then pulling in data. And we now live in a world where data are ever more plentiful and ever larger so that we can look at bigger populations of whether it be people or stars or animal populations or whatever it is. And so, and we are inundated with a lot of data. And so I wanted to take a step back for those educators and for those just concerned citizens who are faced with so much data and all of the stories that we may be facing, because some of them will be accurate and some of them aim to persuade and to make us believe things. And so to be a savvy consumer of news output and stories today. I'm curious about your thoughts about what are the skills that students or anybody needs to be a savvy reader of any type of news story? And is it different now that there's a lot of data out in the world? What are your thoughts?
Hmm. That's a great question and a really big one. Um, Unfortunately, I would say, well, I don't know if it's fortunate or not, but I would say one thing that I find myself, especially in this period of um, really rapid change in what AI is capable of and how it is being used, it can be incredibly hard to even trust your own eyes and know if a video is real. And so I find myself falling back in a lot of cases almost purely on trust, right? Who is telling me this information and do I trust them that they are actually showing me a real video? That is something that humans have done consciously or unconsciously throughout all of evolution, right? Do I trust the messenger? I just think that's even more important now because there are limits to how much our critical thinking skills can necessarily tease apart. Um, but the other skills that I would say are critical thinking and also, so knowing to even just ask the question, is this trustworthy? Does this fit with what else I know? That's not necessarily, if it doesn't, a reason to throw it out, but it's a reason to ask a set of questions, right? Is what I've known before actually wrong? What would be the evidence for that? So just really being willing to ask a lot of questions, I think is important. And then the other thing I would say is um, maybe less about needing to know less about how to actually like crunch numbers, but needing to understand how data are derived is really, really important. What was the process that got us to these numbers? And what does that tell me about what the analysis and the output might mean? And again, that's not always easy, but I think in a lot of cases, I mean, call to action for our educators, make sure that we're teaching our students a lot of different scientific methods. There is not just one method. And so really understanding what goes into deriving data and analyzing data, I think is really, really important.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. And just staying with you, Heather, again, well, if that was the kind of consumer side, you as a science communicator, as a storyteller, what would you say? You alluded to this. What are your key strategies for telling compelling stories with data? And you were talking about finding those representative examples. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that because data are plural, right? And so data stories, they tell us about populations. They tell us about trends and what's happening either over time or with large groups of people or units or whatever. But you were saying that what moves people, and this is what I'm curious what the science says, in order for people to remember, in order for people to relate to what you're talking about, it's hard for them to hear stories about groups. You have to hear something about an individual in their experience. Is that like a universal truth? Is that just a key strategy? What can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I think there are data that show that the human brain responds more strongly to um, an individual or a smaller number and a deeper connection to their experience than to a big number, right? So if you think about um, the power that a single photojournalist's portrait of a child in a war-torn country who has fled and is a refugee who is suffering from famine, any of those things, right? I think often um, that is portrayed in a negative light as trying to manipulate people's emotions, but the reality is that that is what people respond emotionally to, is to see one other human face and to really be able to see and understand that person's pain or that person's experience. And again, as you said, what data can help us do is understand whether that one person's experience, um, not not whether or not that experience is true, but whether it is representative, whether it is shared by others, whether it is more, unusual or unique. And that can then help us uh, figure out how to use that information, right? One person suffering is that person is no less suffering because they are alone in their experience potentially, but we might respond to that in a different way. Society and individuals might respond to that in a different way. So it means something different when you know whether that is a unique case or a representative case of hundreds, thousands, millions of people. And so I think, yeah, it's pairing those two. I don't think that emotional response is inherently bad or wrong. It is human, and it can also be powerful. But yes, but being aware from the storytelling side how that is being potentially used, to what end that is being used, and understanding from the consumer side what it actually means.
Great. So that's really helpful. So I want to turn that question to you now, Christina, to think about because you're saying maps are powerful. You've seen maps have powerful effects on people. And can you share some of your thoughts about, well, why? Heather was talking about human stories, and maps are often these big expanses of 2D large land masses usually with lots of different colors. So where's the human element in a map if or is it a different process that moves people through a map? Can you share some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think maps are so powerful because they can communicate things so quickly in a way that any other medium just can't do. And I can give an example. at a mapping workshop that I was facilitating in Anchorage, Alaska this past fall. Um, the participants, some of them came from communities that were absolutely devastated by Typhoon Halong. And they had the opportunity to um, talk to Alaskan representatives about their experiences and what their communities need, like in that post-disaster moment. And the Alaskan government had certain data numbers on what percentage of their community, like infrastructure, was damaged. And they were saying, oh, it's 30%. And one of the participants said, no, it's not. And she pulled up a map and showed exactly which houses and infrastructure were damaged. And it immediately, you heard them gasp because they just immediately saw it. Like she said it in words for about a minute beforehand, and then she pulled up the map and then they understood. So she was telling a story, you can kind of get it, but then when they see it on the map, it just really, really clicked with them. And yeah, in a very emotional way because their entire community was affected by this.
Was it the map that made them gasp, or was it a photo, like seeing something damaged, or it was the scale of the the area of what they saw damaged that moved them? I'm just trying to understand what you think.
Yeah, I think it was the scale. Like they had thought that m much less of the community buildings were affected, and the map immediately shows no, it was a majority of the buildings in our community are completely destroyed. And you can throw out numbers, but until you see it, sometimes it just doesn't hit in the same way. Um, and it wasn't until she pulled up the map that you could see their reaction change. And you could see the light bulb kind of go off.
Huh, that's really interesting. So, staying with you, Christina, you were talking about how you were going through school studying rivers, and then eventually a lot of your skills you said were self-taught at night and over weekends. And so I know there are going to be people in the audience who are curious, like, how did you teach yourself? Or what are those skills that you feel that you needed to learn to do what you do now? Um, and yeah, how did you teach yourself? What exactly did you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Whenever I think back on this, I basically looked at maps that I wanted to get paid to make. I was like, what do I want to make and how do I make those? And so I would just try to emulate those things. So when I was going through a Nat Geo story, every map is a very, it has a narrative. It's not just here's a map of precipitation, end of story. It's like, well, how is this precipitation changing the landscape? How is it polluted? How is it the people downstream affected by this? There's a much larger story. And so I would try to find that story and then make a larger map that would tell that. And so a lot of it is just practice. Um, Learning Adobe Illustrator was really big. And so that just requires, YouTube tutorials. Um, it's a lot of just scrappy, like find what you can on the internet, and uh, just playing around with color and design until you find something that works. I wish I had a better formula for how to do this. But yeah, like I said, there's not a lot of cartography education and resources out there. I mean, there are more blogs coming out now about, oh, here's how to create this hillshade in Blender step by step. And like there are things like that that anyone can pick up. But it's not for everything. Yeah, so it's yeah, kind of each person has their own journey, I think, depending on what kind of maps they want to make.
If there were educators who wanted to integrate more of the skills that you need to do your job into their instruction. And I don't know if you think this is an appropriate set of skills to learn in high school or earlier, or mostly in post-secondary, community colleges? You had mentioned there's coding, there's some sort of data analysis that you're doing, there's data visualization, color theory. Like what are the what are the skills that you would teach if you were to form your own school somewhere? What do you think would be important to teach for these important skills that you've identified as really powerful?
That is a very good question and a very big question. Because, yeah, like I was saying, it's a really diverse set of skills. And so it's hard to be like, we're going to teach a class on cartography in one semester. Like, that's not, uh, you have to cover many, many topics. And so I think the thing that kind of connects them all is actually being a generalist. So cartographers, I find, are good at a lot of things. And so it's not necessarily, it's like the thing that we're experts in is data visualization, but then everything else, you have a broad understanding. So just being able to pick up on things very quickly and being adaptable. Um, in terms of things to teach in school, I feel like spatial thinking is really big. Looking back on school reports that I had when I was young, they actually talked about like, oh, she was good at spatial thinking in these spatial games and like even things like, oh, if someone is good at I Spy and they remember where things are, like things like that, you can just like encourage them to, think spatially and like how does our worlds change based on geography. Um, and I think geography also is very interdisciplinary. And so I think people that like to connect everything together would, yeah, I think be interested in cartography. Um, a lot, yeah. And then there's the art side, there's the design, there's color. I mean, there's so many classes that I'm not an educator, so I don't know if I'm the right person to ask actually. But yeah, I'm sure people watching might have other ideas.
No,
I,
that's
I might
great.
I might just jump
Go
in
ahead.
there if I could. Whether it's appropriate to teach at high school level or not, again, I'm not the one to figure that out. But Woodwell did partner with our local high school and also some of our partners at other science organizations in town have partnered with our local high school to help high school students make maps of issues. I think in particular, they were working with like the Ecology Club and some of um, uh, the higher level classes, the juniors and seniors at the high school, but to help teach them to do that. And yeah, we've got at our high school human geography and we've got computer science. And so we've got a lot of those pieces that Christina was talking about being the groundwork. And so you get some motivated students who I think one of the other key things there is Christina was talking about like seeing the maps, the kinds of maps and kinds of stories she wanted to tell. These students really had stories they wanted to tell about our place. And I'll just say the other thing I think that is so powerful about the maps that I've seen is um, all of those things Christina was talking about, whether it's rain on the landscape or the shape of the landscape, the vegetation, right? Um, we also have a deep sense of connection to place and to places, and we're deeply connected with our environment. And the maps can kind of be a way of putting that into a form that you can then show to someone in a way that you might not otherwise be able to do, and also to see your own reality reflected that way. And I've seen people respond really strongly of like, oh, that's my place, right? Like that's that place that I really love. Or, oh, yeah, when it rains, so being able to both see that and then reflect that to other people. And so I think that can also be a real motivator for people who want to make maps and be able to share what they're holding about their knowledge of their environment and their place with other people.
That's a really interesting insight. It's making me wonder. You said earlier, Heather, there's research showing that people connect and find relevance through other people's stories if they can find something parallel, I guess. But also there are these connections to land and environment, maybe one's home, maybe landforms or the sights and the smells and the all the colors and all of that. There's that connection too that can move people. That's really interesting. There is a question, there are a couple questions in the chat. So I'm going to draw from here and I'll turn this. There's one for Christina, but I'll turn to Heather since we've been talking about maps for a little bit. Um, so Heather, you have a solid background, or while a solid background in science is important for you to be able to talk about and report on science, what other skills do you think are necessary for good climate communication? Is it public speaking? Is it creative writing, psychology? That's the question that Nadia placed.
Yes. Um, all of the above. I was definitely kind of nodding along as Christina was talking about like pulling together your own skill set. As I shared, my only formal training is in science, not in communication. So there's been a lot of on the job and life learning throughout all of it. Um, it's interesting in terms of having a science background and being in science communication. That can honestly be as much of a detriment as it can a benefit. I had a really interesting experience as a very new reporter where someone really only took the interview because I had a PhD. And so he figured that I wouldn't be one of those journalists who botched the story, right? From his perspective, I would know what he was talking about. The problem with that was that I couldn't get him to talk to me like a human being or anybody that anyone else could understand. And this was radio. And I literally sat with him for like over 2 hours and had to go back to the station and tell my editor, we have to kill the story. I have zero usable tape from 2 hours because he was so excited about the X-ray crystal structure that he had gotten back the hour before. And he said repeatedly, like, and you'll understand this. And I was like, yeah, but nobody else will, right? So um, that can also come up in terms of there's a point at which having too much information or too much knowledge of a subject area can kind of give you blinders to what you need to ask and what other people may not be getting about the story. So I think there's a real balance there. That's not to say that, you know, reporters, journalists with deep expertise in their subject knowledge are not incredibly valuable. Uh, Storytellers, information research resources, and thought leaders, right? But there's definitely a balance to be found there. And I would say the most important thing that I got from my science background for science communication is the understanding of the scientific process, because that helps me understand what questions I need to ask, right? Questions about uncertainty and confidence intervals and about methodology and surprises and how they handled surprises, a whole suite of questions that if you don't know the scientific method really deeply, if you haven't done that, those questions may not come as naturally. And so for that reason, we're actually this summer, for the first time here at Woodwell, doing a program that some of our scientists have done at other organizations before, which is taking journalists out into the field for 2 weeks of immersion in science, not for them to come out as a reporter and report on the science, but to literally go out with graduate students and assist with their research so that they get and then to analyze the data, maybe make some rudimentary maps, make some graphs at the very least, right? And go through that whole process so that they have a firsthand understanding of what that process is like and what they think the data means when they get to the end of that process so that they can kind of see themselves on the flip side of their interviews.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so I want to stay on this kind of theme about skills and what you need to know now that we're in a world of AI. And I'm curious about how has that changed work for you, for both of you? Are you using AI tools? In what ways? And there's lots of talk about how data analysis is going to go away with AI. Writing is going to go away with AI. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are. What can AI do for you and what can it not do for you? I
You
don't
want
know
to
who
go
wants to
first,
go first.
Christina?
Sure, yeah. So AI for me has helped it a lot with coding. Coding is something where, I mean, partly getting to Nadia's question, when I was in grad school, I took two classes on two different coding software or programs. And then shortly after grad school, all of a sudden there was this really big push to know how to code. And it just what when you're working and you're living your life, it was really hard to learn, and without using it consistently. But now with I can just type in like I want to download deforestation data from 2000 to 2020, and I want it to be like change this on this color ramp, for this part of the world at this resolution, and then it just spits it out. And that's incredible. But that only gets me 80% of the way. Oftentimes, AI will write it incorrectly. It'll take it from the wrong data set, even though I gave it the data set. It will, there's always something that I have to tweak. And I go back and forth with it. I'm like, this is wrong, fix it this way. And it's a back and forth with AI until it gets it right. And I have to check and know I have to know enough code to understand what it's doing, but I just don't have to be write the whole thing from scratch. So I think that's where AI comes in, where it makes my job more efficient, but it's not it hasn't gotten to the point where it can replace me yet. Um, but yeah, and then in terms of writing, I have to write a lot for my maps, but I'm not a writer per se. So I will give AI like what I want to say. I'll like have a first go and then I'll be like, but make it under 200 words and it's for this audience. And I give it the parameters and the information and then it'll just help me edit it a lot faster. So I think AI for me has just made things more efficient and get me to a better result in the end. Um, yeah. Heather?
Sure. I mean, well, for one, even just, defining AI. So if we're talking specifically about like generative AI, large language models, that's one thing. But a lot of the large data sets that are out there, those have been generated or are being and have been for years, um, analyzed using machine learning to find patterns and to work with data on scales that a human, it would take us entire lifetimes, right? We have one project that is searching for specific landforms in the Arctic using satellite data. And the area is so huge. The number of photos is so huge that we couldn't possibly do that. But we can train AI to look at it, and an AI, a machine learning model, can actually go through and find, and again, to Christina's point, make predictions and send those predictions to a scientist to say, did I get it right? Right? Never the whole thing. It's never totally independent. Um, the ways that I use AI are fairly limited. I definitely have concerns about the ethics of how a lot of these models were built, and also a lot of concerns about the biases that are built into whether it's generative AI or a lot of the other algorithms that we have, how those are trained, the data that are used to train those. And again, asking questions about where did that data come from? What might be missing from that? What might be overrepresented? How was it interpreted? Right? We build biases into our algorithms, whether or not we necessarily realize it. And that comes out in a whole lot of ways that facial recognition um, may have gotten better, but for a very long time was much worse at recognizing darker skinned faces because they were largely trained on Caucasian and by Caucasian um, individuals, right? So there's being very cautious of that. With that, the ways that I use the most common way, two ways that I use something like a Chat GPT, a generative large language model. Um, I use it to try to find information, collate information more quickly. right? To do the same search essentially over and over and over, but for 10 different towns or for, instead of going and doing that and putting it all into a spreadsheet and saying, okay, just hand me all the data. So that's one way that I use it. The other is I use it as an ideation partner, right? When I'm trying to come up with an idea for how to approach something, it's really easy for me to get stuck in thinking about the question or the problem or the task at hand in one way and kind of get stuck in one idea space. And AI has zero attachment to its own beautiful ideas. And so I can say, give me 10 different ideas. Actually, give me 10 different ones. Make them different in this way, right? And there's a saying in journalism, it takes 10 bad headlines to come up with one good one, right? Or more broadly, it takes 10 bad ideas to come up with a good idea. So I use AI to help me get 10, 20, 50 ideas so that I can then go, oh, I like that one, maybe that one. Let's put these together to expedite that kind of ideation phase of things and then move things forward with human brains to actually do the creative work that comes after.
Great. We're nearing the end of our time here, so I'm going to throw out a couple questions. See, just lightning response, and then we'll have to wrap it up, and you can choose who wants to answer. Nadia has asked another question. You work at a climate science organization. How do you grapple with the negative environmental impacts of AI and as you use these tools? So that's one question. And I wanted to honor a question that came in from a registrant in advance. How do you get a job in your field? Any tips? Any tips for people who might be interested in being a science communicator or cartographer? So those are a bunch of questions. Answer what you wish. Go.
I can quickly answer Nadia's question, which is that the AI world that we're living in, it's happening. We can't stop it. It's going to keep advancing. It's going to be part of our lives for the foreseeable future. So we should use it to our advantage to to improve our climate science and to tackle climate change. Um, and hopefully with those advancements, it will offset some of those environmental impacts. Of course, we can't know that, but that's just a very short 20-second take.
Uh, Slightly different but similar. How do we grapple with that really intentionally, right? Thinking about whether or not each use is actually worth it, the same as flying, which we still do to get to meetings and field sites, and everything comes with a cost. So being intentional. Um, and the second one, how do you get a job? Ask. Over and over and over ask. I mean, and I know that my career path is unusual, but literally every single one of those transitions happened not because someone uh put out the perfect job ad and I was the perfect candidate, but because I walked into a radio station and said, "Do you want a science reporter?" I wrote a grant to write a blog. I went to my boss and said, "I think we need a show." Like over and over, it's ask.
Awesome. Just ask. You won't find out unless you ask. Did you want to say something, Christina?
Yeah, just quickly. One is a portfolio. Getting a job in cartography, you have to have a portfolio. So if you're brand new, you have to make maps and build up your portfolio. And hopefully that portfolio is of maps that you want to get paid to make, like I said earlier. And the second is the flip side of what Heather said, which is when I interviewed at places, so it's like I got to, some final stage, the last five or whatever. If I didn't get it, I would ask them why. And usually at that point, that you've invested enough time in each other that they always answered me and they were always like kind and direct and said, these were the things that we liked about you, but these were the things that we were looking for that we need. And then I could decide, okay, that's something that I want to do and I want to be better at. So I'm going to work on that skill. Or I can say, actually, that's not something that I want to do. This job wasn't right for me, and now I have a better direction. And so I think asking why you don't get jobs really helped me in my career.
Awesome. Thanks for that advice, words of wisdom for those out there who are now in the process. So we're at the end of our time. We're actually a tiny bit over. I want to thank both Heather and Christina. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, sharing your insights and your journeys. Thank you for everyone who attended this webinar. Jen is going to send a very short, well, it's in the slide. No, it's not in the slide. She will send a brief anonymous 3-question survey. So please give us some feedback on today's session. If you're interested in our Teacher PD workshops or classroom curriculum materials, please, or our career hub of resources, please visit us at datapaths.edc.org. You can sign up for our mailing list for future events. We will post this recording, and that's about it. So thank you everybody for attending, and we hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.